The 1986-87 season was an exciting one for Spurs, under David Pleat's management and his innovative 5 across midfield and 1 up-front formation, which was way ahead of its time. With Hoddle and Waddle pulling the strings, supported by Paul Allen, Ozzy and Steve Hodge in midfield, with Clive Allen banging in the goals for fun all season. For a while, Spurs were challenging on all fronts. A last-minute League Cup semi-final replay goal had deprived them a chance to reach the League Cup final and, after tailing off a little, finishing a respectable 3rd place in the league. However, successive excellent performances and victories had seen the team through to the 1987 FA Cup final. To the neutral, it was probably one of the most exciting cup finals in years. Most neutrals were backing the so-called underdogs, Coventry City, appearing in their first ever FA Cup final. Ultimately, the cup final would end, like the season, in disappointment, as we went down 3-2 in extra time, to suffer our first, and to date, only FA Cup final defeat. It's not the cup final match itself we wish to dwell on today, but rather the biggest and costliest cup final fashion fail that occurred that fateful day. However, let's back up a minute. For the 1985-86 and 1986-87 seasons, Spurs had been wearing, what remains to this day, one of the most popular home kits, a Hummel-branded, all-white design. Whilst Spurs were used to traditionally wearing all-white for the European nights, to lack the blue shorts for the domestic season was an unusual change. That said, in a time where 2nd and 3rd kits weren't worn at the drop of a hat like they are today, the blue shorts did make an appearance when we played against opponents wearing white shorts. Ahead of the cup final, Spurs and Hummel had already designed the new kit for the following 1987-88 season, where a return to the traditional blue shorts would occur. They also planned to wear the new kit for the cup final, but in line with the 1986-87 kit, intended to stick with white shorts for the day at Wembley. This is where it got a little bit troublesome, as the club, with all eyes on the new kit, hadn't considered that Coventry's home strip featured white shorts too. And while that doesn't seem to trouble teams today, back then it was a no-no. In fact, the Spurs and Coventry's kits were considered too much of a clash, that when the two teams had met in the league at Highfield Road earlier in the season, the ref wouldn't allow the Spurs shirt, even with a change of shorts, and, with no alternatives with them, Spurs actually had to play that match wearing the Coventry's yellow away kit. A sensible compromise was reached between the clubs and the FA, in that both clubs would swap short colours they'd wear, and therefore both clubs would be allowed to wear their home shirts for the final. In some ways, with footballers being rather superstitious, both clubs were more than happy. Coventry had worn navy shorts in beating Leeds United in the semi-finals, and Tottenham themselves had worn all white when they won theirs against Watford. And so, onto the final. Coventry had no issue duly wearing what was agreed and not confusing the issue with a new kit. Just the usual cup final logo, traditionally embroidered onto their shirts. Spurs, on the other hand, had issues getting dressed into their new kits. When the teams came out and made the famous walk out of the Wembley tunnel and across the pitch, their fashion faux pas was yet to be exposed, as they were wearing their cup final tracksuit tops over their shirts. Once the formalities of the national anthem and meeting the dignitaries was over, the teams removed their tracksuit tops and prepared for the match. It was then a slow realization from those watching, particularly the Holston officials and guests, that the team they'd paid millions to sponsor had some players who'd failed to get the beers in. In fact, 6 of the 13 players who featured did not have Holston emblazoned across their chests. The aftermath was one of fury, embarrassment, blame, accountability, and inevitably some mickey-taking. It was front-page headlines in the press, with sponsors' fury over the mistake, with threats of legal action and huge financial penalties for the club, with a £1 million figure being thrown about. Meanwhile, the PR team at one of Holston's main drinks rivals, Carlin, superbly ran a full-page advert, featuring one Spurs player with the sponsor's name on his shirt, and another with it missing. It fitted their famous catchphrase perfectly, as they claimed for the player missing Holston's name, "I bet he drinks Carlin Black Label." The subject has been visited in more than a few books. Here's Clive Allen in There's Only One Clive Allen. I can honestly say that no one in the dressing room noticed anything amiss before we went out. You just don't look at things like what is written on your shirt a few minutes before you go out to play in an FA Cup final. All you are thinking about is the game ahead. The first I noticed was when we were warming up out on the pitch. I saw there was no sponsor's name written on Glenn Hoddle's shirt. He came towards me and I said to him, "What about your Holston?" Quick as a flash, he replied, "Clive, I've got a game to play. I don't think we should have a drink just now." Gary Mabbott, in Winning Their Spurs. The kit comes folded with their numbers showing, so you don't see the front of the shirt. In the dressing room, we put our shirts on and then we put our cup final tracksuit straight on. We went out not knowing, and it was only just before the game that anyone noticed. I'd taken my tracksuit off and Chris Houghton, who was standing next to me, said, "Look at your shirt." When we looked around, there were about 5 or 6 of us without Holston on our shirts. We didn't change. It was a huge thing and caused a lot of uproar. Roy Rayland, Spurs kit man, in his autobiography Shirts, Shorts and Spurs, said, "I watched from the stands as the team trotted out onto the pitch and stripped off their warm-up jackets to prepare for kickoff. I could instantly tell something was wrong but couldn't put my finger on it." Typically, Johnny Wallace, at that point Spurs senior kit man, had been his usual guarded self when it came to the first team kit, and had personally sent the shirts off to have the words FA Cup Final 1987 embroidered below the cockerel. What he somehow missed was that only half of them carried the name of the beer brand that had paid us hundreds of thousands of pounds to be seen on the players' chests during the biggest televised game of the year. It became possibly the best advertising Spurs and Holston ever had. But for Johnny, I was heartbroken. It's every kit man's nightmare to make a mistake. It's the kind of thing you dread, and for it to happen to Johnny, after 3 decades of absolute dedication to detail and an obsessive attention to perfection, it was the worst last day of a career you could possibly imagine. I officially took over as kit manager during the weeks following that ill-fated final. No one would ask Johnny any questions, but a few weeks later I summoned the courage to ask him, not just out of curiosity, but also out of genuine fear of repeating the same mistake. We had some shirts made up for the youth team, and because these lads are not 18 years old, it's illegal for them to advertise an alcoholic brand. The blank shirts had found their way into the bag on the way to the embroiderers, and by the time they arrived at Wembley it was just too late to do anything about it. And from Spurs chairman Irving Scholars behind closed doors. I was so engrossed in the game that it was not until around 35 minutes that someone tapped me on the shoulder to draw my attention to the fact that some of the players had the Holston logo missing from their shirts. I tried to get someone to find Peter Day, the then Tottenham secretary, at halftime so that he could contact the dressing room about the shirts, but he was nowhere to be found. I later discovered what happened was that 4 sets of shirts had been delivered to the club about 3 weeks before the final. There were 2 sets of long-sleeved and 2 sets of short-sleeved, but only 1 set of the short-sleeved had the sponsor's name printed on them. For weeks, they lay in Peter Day's office, nobody bothering about them, nobody expecting a problem. The day before Wembley, Johnny Wallace loaded them in the skips. Amazingly, nobody in the dressing room noticed, and David Pleat explained afterwards that the tension was so great that the sponsor's logo was the last thing on the player's mind. On the Monday morning, I, along with David Pleat, Peter Day, and Mike Rollo, commercial manager, met Holston. We feared the worst, but Alan Bridget, Holston's chairman, took a very understanding view and made it clear that there was no question of withdrawing the sponsorship. But if relations with Holston were repaired, there were some casualties at Tottenham as a result of this fiasco. John Wallace was relegated to the reserve team, Roy Rayland took over as the first team kit man, and poor Peter Day lost his job. I was sorry to see him go, and had no hesitation in giving him references later. Well, that was the story behind the Spurs Cup final fashion failure. Thanks for watching and we hope you liked it. If you could hit that subscribe button, it would be really appreciated. It helps us produce further Spurs nostalgia videos and quizzes.